All right, well, again, thank you guys for being here. This is the start of a new quarter. We're going to run for 14 weeks here. And tonight is really just an overview of the topic. We're going to discuss what the topic is, why we came to the decision of teaching this topic, and then also how is it going to be taught throughout our different 14 weeks. So as you guys can see, we're going to be doing church history. So they finally got the history teacher to teach church history up here. Ryan taught this class now 2 quarters ago downstairs in the high school room. I didn't as much teach it with him as just sitting on the class and learn and sit down and hear the questions from the high schoolers, to have those discussions with them. And a lot of really great product came out of that. And so it has been kind of morphed and modified in a couple different ways. And that same material has been brought upstairs now for us. The title of this class, though, I played with a little bit because whenever we hear church history, I think we automatically have some thoughts about, are we going to be memorizing the birthday of Martin Luther? What really is the point of this? And I honestly welcome the skepticism in that. We're taking 14 weeks to study a topic, so it should be something of great value to us, something that is definitely going to increase our faith. My argument tonight, in this particular Wednesday night, is to argue yes. It is worth our time. It will build up our faith, and it's going to have a great product at the end of it. So we called this a topical overview of where we come from. We're not going to be going in a strict chronological order. So we're not going to start in Acts and march our way through the early church fathers, through the Middle Ages, to the Reformation. Instead, we're going to go topically. So we might talk about something such as cooperation in the church. And what we'll do is we're going to spend one Wednesday night learning the biblical pattern, the biblical examples that we see on that topic, followed by the next Wednesday evening where we will study examples throughout history. Another example will be worship. We'll talk about music. How do we worship based off of the biblical pattern? That will be one Wednesday, followed by the next Wednesday where we trace that throughout history. How well have we done? Where have we struggled? Where are we now? Any questions about class before we get going? I will say I'm so used to doing 2 things. 1, teaching early American history and not church history. And 2, walking around the classroom. So I'm so tempted to walk around and to make sure that people are taking their notes. But I'm trapped behind the podium for this. But we'll go ahead and get started. Tonight is just our introduction. And to break the ice a little bit, I want to talk about some stereotypes of history. So I got a couple different questions up on the board, and I really do want to hear your input about this. The picture that I have there, if anyone can guess the movie, is Ferris Bueller. The very famous Bueller is an offense to history teachers because that's a history classroom. And so whenever they keep panning back to the boring lesson where everyone's drooling, has their head down, unfortunately, not only is that history, but it's early American history, which is so sad. But I kind of want to hear, what are our thoughts about history? I want us to be honest about it, because if we're going to approach a history class, we should probably see, where are we at? So how would you describe your high school history class? What do you remember? And how would you describe the teacher? Go ahead.
I'd say it was also very intense. There was lots of things to cover. AP US and then AP World, there was just so much information from so far back that we have to learn. And then the teachers are the exact same way. They're so intense about making sure that you know this information.
Yeah, I think history, almost above other subjects, has a huge piece of memorization that people have associated with it. So yeah, this great volume. Talk about church history. We're really going to have 2,000 years that we have to cover. How are we going to do that? Yes, ma'am.
I have the opposite experience. I went to a small school, so all my history teachers were coaches, and they were just really coaches. They were not history teachers. So I did not learn a lot in history in high school.
Yeah, I think that's really the experience of a lot of us too. And I'm glad that we kind of have some positive and negative examples, because we can see that history, when done correctly, when given with a certain bit of direction to it, can be super influential. Not only just in history, but I'm sure with other classes that we've taken growing up in school, that we can remember the subject that was taught because of the teacher. And so what I would really like to do is, why are we studying church history? Well, hopefully the spiritual context and the spiritual topics that we talk about, that will be the motivating force that will help us remember our history just a little bit more. Talk a little bit about old school versus new school. There are a lot of misconceptions about what history is, and then we'll talk a little bit more about what church history is in just a moment. A lot of us have this idea that the history classes today are a lot of things like names and dates, places and battles, quoting and reciting, and so whenever you guys saw, that we're doing church history on the board, that's maybe where your mind immediately went. I think Ryan did a good job of this in the high school class, though, because we're kind of morphing into what they call the new school of history. We're focused more about things like cause and effect. Cause and effect. This happened in this particular location, but we're feeling the effects here in Ellisville. Let's talk about that. Things like identifying bias and perspective, that's actually a standard that we work on with my history students all the time. We talk about slavery and abolition. We want to read the different perspectives. How did they get to where they are belief-wise? And then understanding the how and the why, not just understanding the what. So yes, there are going to be some things that are like, wow, I never knew that. That's a fun fact. But at the end of the day, how is history going to motivate us to dig deeper spiritually, to understand our God more, and to understand the relationship that we have in his church? That's our goal for today. Now let's talk about more specifically, why study then church history? Church history. I'll open this up to us, and then I have it broken down into 3 different categories, but there might be more, there might be less. But I talked a little bit about why we study history in general, what's the purpose of that discipline, but why church history? Why do we think it would be important to spend 14 weeks on this topic?
I think when talking to people who are not Christians, New Testament Christians, there can be a lot of misconceptions on what it is to be a Christian, and it's really handy to have a rough understanding of where their idea might come from. And once again, not memorizing names and dates, but just knowing like, oh, that's Calvinism. Maybe this is how we should talk about that.
Yeah, 2 things I see specifically in that comment. One, that we can use our knowledge of church history to share the gospel with other people. It could be an active part. And then the other one, we just need to know generally what we're talking about here. No one is expecting you to become a scholar. No one here is going to be an expert on this, but to understand conversationally where we come from should be important to us. Do you have one, Jay?
Yeah, I had, this kind of more internally, even things that occurred, I'm thinking like 50s and 60s, some of the things that went on with the church. Some people may not understand why we even do certain things that other churches may not do, even churches of Christ.
Yeah.
So those are things that when we talk about that, then it's more like an understanding of how things happen the way they did, why we believe certain ways that we do, others, why they may believe different than that.
Yeah,
So it's
definitely.
important to look at that.
The how and why. The how and why. How did we get to where we are right now? Why do we do the things that we do? I see another one? Yeah.
When God wrote the scripture, a lot of it is covered in a historical format to learn from the good and the bad of what people chose to do in the past, and in a way to gain experience more so than what we just gain firsthand. And so it's a similar thing as we look at people practicing Christianity through the years and see, where they succeeded, where they failed, and try to learn things from it.
Yeah, God has used history as his preferred method of teaching. The law is not all law. It's actually quite a bit of history. So yeah, it has a great benefit to us there. Anyone else? Okay, so here's how I broke it down. Again, I think we can see everyone's comments probably in one category or another. I think about our identity. This is probably to Jay's point. Who are we as believers? Jake said specifically as New Testament believers. What does that look like? How do we identify ourselves? And what does that look like, right? Our identity. A great example of that is, why would Luke write the book of Acts? Why did God deem it so important that the history of his early church be written down? Why could we have not just ended with the Great Commission? I think it has to do with identity. Continuity and change. we're going to see, where have these certain biblical patterns possibly strayed? And then there have always been situations, there's always been people and groups of people who have wanted to go back to something of an original pattern, back to the basic understandings of New Testament Christianity. We're going to look at those changes too, what motivated those individuals to go back to basics. And then a piece of evidence, this probably speaks most to Jake's point, is our faith supported by history? This is where I'll say the disclaimer. I don't need history to be confident in Christ. I don't need that. I genuinely do not. I am sufficient understanding the gospel message as it is recorded, and I have full assurance in the blood. All of that is true. History can help. History can help. History can be an aid. I'm going to break this down just a little bit more into what particularly history has taught us already in the biblical narrative. I have an example up on the board that I want us to turn to real quick, and then I want to hear some different examples from you guys as well. So history is all about learning from past mistakes and achievements. We do not just teach the Bible stories downstairs. We don't just talk about the Bible stories around our kitchen table. In order for us to understand something as like a Grimm's fairy tale. No, we do this because it teaches us a certain pattern of right and wrong. I think that this comes out beautifully in the beginning of Genesis. So if you guys want to turn over to Genesis chapter 11, we'll look at a cool compare and contrast. Those of you who have been staying on the Thursdays for the Genesis study, this is something that we just looked at. And I thought, this would be a really cool example to do here in the church history class. Because just within, 2 chapters of the Bible, we have an example of a historic narrative. And we have to ask ourselves, why was that included? Why did God choose 2 chapters to go into a historic narrative? Well, my argument is going to be, it's going to teach us a point about right and wrong. Let's pick up first in Genesis chapter 11. We'll read just the beginning story of Babel. Could I have someone read chapter 11, verses 1 through 4? Let's do 1 through 4.
Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth."
So we understand this story as an early civilization trying to do things their own way. But why include that? Why have that in the biblical story? So I'll ask this question to us. Why did God record a history for us here? What's the purpose? What's the point? Why record a history?
It's a negative example of people who chose to kind of stand against God and be kind of contrary to his commandments to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, go and be kind of fill up his earth versus let's stay here and think about ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just thinking too that it's like this all started with Adam and Eve eating fruit. And for 11 chapters, we've spiraled, and you can kind of say, okay, when you step away from God, this is where it ends. We can learn that whole pattern, and if we're not going to learn from it, then we'll repeat it ourselves.
Definitely, yeah. Go ahead, Dave.
I see it highlighting God's offense towards pride and how he demonstrates that's not what this is all about.
I think about it in the situation with Noah. We know that there is great wickedness on the earth. Some of that is described, maybe not as much detail as what we would like to have. But here's a story. I think we relate on a very human level, on a very personal level, to story. And so rather than God saying, and there were those who went farther away from me, who went farther away where originally I dwelled, and they began to do their own thing. Now let's learn about Abraham. He takes the time to talk about the particular things that they did. In our Genesis class, the thing that we emphasized was the language of, we will make a name for ourselves, let us do this, make our names great. And so let's contrast that now with another history story, another narrative over in Genesis chapter 12. Just one chapter over, if I could have someone read. The calling of Abraham. Let's do verses just 1 through 3, please. 12, 1 through 3.
Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country, from your kindred, your father's house, to the land I will show you. And I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed.
Thank you. So I'll go ahead and answer this one. Do we see now that the story of the calling of Abraham has a little bit more oomph to it once we contrast that just earlier where there's a group of people who rebelled against God, who did things their own way? In our study, the thing that we emphasized here was the I statements of God. I will show you, I will make you a great nation, I will bless, I will bless. Contrast that then with the people in the Tower of Babel story. So I hope that this is just a quick example, and I'm pausing here because I want to hear more examples from you guys. But this is history. This is history. I know we don't technically always think about it as history, but God is using a narrative type story based on factual events to identify good character and bad character. I'll open it up to you guys right now. We don't necessarily have to turn there and do the whole study on it, but some examples of a narrative of history that has been recorded in the Bible, and then whether you think that was recorded to talk about a bad pattern or a good pattern. So think about the stories that we've been taught, maybe at a younger age, maybe a story that you just came across, and you're like, you know what? I know why he put that story in. It was supposed to teach me this.
My mind goes to Judges, how the story of the Judges is a historical story about real people, but at the same time it's put together in a way that very much shows the downfall of God's people without a king.
Yeah, definitely. And we have to think, too, that the records that we have in the Bible were not just recorded for the sake of a history book. They were intentionally put together and pieced together with repeated phrases, with repeated themes, in order to make God's point even greater. And so oftentimes we talk about the Gospels, right? We've been doing John, but then also in Mark, how Mark does his sandwich points. Again, that is God taking real historical fact and molding it into a literary style that makes sense to us, that brings out some sort of a moral. Do we have another example? I love Judges. Yeah.
Could you repeat the question to make sure I'm...
No, definitely. So the example that I have up here about how history can teach us failures and successes. The examples that I did was Babel and then Abraham, but the biblical narrative is full of tons and tons of other stories that were put there not to just tell us a good bedtime story, but to teach us either a failure of humanity or a success.
Well, one of the ones that I was looking at was Stephen, who retold the story of his people, and he got stoned for it, but before the Sanhedrin and Ephesus.
Yeah.
That's one that came to mind.
We're going to go there in about 3 slides. I love Stephen. Stephen's story is the best. I love Stephen because he's really like the first New Testament historian. He goes up and he says, I believe what I believe. Why? Here's the history. I love it. Jake, did you have one?
Yeah, I think of the book of Chronicles because we already had most of those stories in Kings. So what were they trying to do, or what is the writer trying to do? And it's driving home the point of we need a Davidic king, and then ultimately as Christians we have our Davidic king in Jesus. And so it's using the stories of the kings of Israel and Judah and then saying, but we need something better. And we have it.
Definitely.
Like the bookmaster too, right? You see this without God's name even being spoken. You see the providential care and a people, the Jewish nation, taking to the brink of extinction.
to see these contrasts remind us again and again what we have recorded down for us, yes, is a record of historical events, but it's not a history textbook. There's message and there's meaning and there's moral principle that we take out of that. What we're going to try to do in this class is to say, so is true with the 2,000 years of church history. We can study these movements, we can study these people, we can study these groups, not for the sense of making really good flashcards, but by understanding, why did they do that? Why did they change? What motivated them to turn their head towards the biblical pattern? That's where we're going to be this semester. I'm going to push forward just a little bit. Another reason why I would argue that we should study this class has to do with the direction that history takes. History takes a very biased approach. There's a saying in the teaching profession that there's no such thing as an unbiased history textbook. Even if you write it as moderately as you can, it is biased because of the stories you put in it and take out of it. So let's learn a little bit about directing us away from the bad and towards the good. Let's go ahead and start in 1 Corinthians. First Corinthians chapter 10, please. And then if I could have a reader for 1 through 6, please. 1 through 6.
For I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they were drinking from a spiritual rock which followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not well pleased, for they were laid low in the wilderness. Now these things happened as an example for us, so that we would not crave evil things as they also craved.
I think a very simple way that I could have introduced the purpose of this class would be to repeat there, why are we studying church history? Do not be unaware, brothers. That's why we're studying this. Do not be unaware when a doctrinal discussion comes up, when a point of our history is questioned. We need to have a bit of defense for that. Do not be unaware, brothers. Do we have any comments here about this verse, particularly about this last section? What is the author saying? What's Paul saying here was the purpose of the Old Testament? What's the purpose of recording these stories?
Can I jump down
Yeah,
a little farther to verse
please.
11? These things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. And then you have the therefore. Therefore, let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. And so it's like, these stories are God's way of teaching us to be careful. And I think that last thing is, if we're not careful from these stories or from the stories of history, we will fall.
And how do we know that? Because of the pattern of the Old Testament. Look at our fathers in the wilderness. We have an example of how they acted and how they were treated. Let's do something opposite of that. Dave?
It's been a while since I've read this, and I'm glad you stopped us at verse 6. I think Brian's right, skipping down. And at the same time, that we might not desire evil as they did. That's very profound to me. Because in the wilderness, we see them complaining and crying out, why this, why this, why this. And it makes you really resonate and reflect back on, well, what was the specifics that would cause them to desire evil, or what was it that they did that demonstrated desiring evil. So that's very interesting to me. You landed on it.
And this class is not going to be far away from issues that have a lot of emotion with them, issues that have brought some controversy. And what I want to do is not only to look at the biblical text, but to look at different situations throughout history and to plead with you all, let's not desire that evil. Let's not desire to do that, because look what happened in the biblical pattern. Look what happened with this particular group. So we would be wrong to desire that, to go back. Thank you. Any other comments, or I'll push ahead to the psalm? All right, let's do Psalm 78. Psalm 78. And then I'll have a reader 1 through 4, please.
Give ear, O my people, to my teaching. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings from of old, things that we have heard and known, that our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from their children, but tell them to the coming generation, the glorious deeds of the Lord and his might and the wonders that he has done.
Thank you. This psalm specifically goes into different acts that the Lord has taken with his people Israel to protect them, to guard them, to guide them. And those are the glorious deeds that were referred to. But the point that I want to focus on here is really verses 3 and 4. The things that we have heard and known, the things that we will not hide from our children, that we're going to tell to the future generations. Yes, we want to do that. We want to tell them, but what's the first thing we have to do? We have to hear them and we have to know them. God's grace with his church, God's providence with his people does not end at the biblical narrative. We have 2,000 years worth of history where God's protection still exists. God's help and guidance still exist. We have to know it. We have to hear it and we know it so we can pass it on to our children's. Why? Well, ultimately, so we can glorify God of his deeds, of his workings in the church. I'm not going to go to the Acts example. Stephen, what was mentioned, basically all of chapter 7 is Stephen's very, let's call it intentional recollection of the Old Testament. He is doing the pattern that we're trying to do in this class. We're not going to sit down and read all 5 books of the law, but we can pick out stories, we can pick out themes that direct us to Christ, We're not just going to be picking up all these different things such as cooperation and money and leadership and worship. We're not doing all of these things just so we can understand our history. Stephen says, no, we're doing all of this because it leads to some sort of pattern that is fulfilled in Christ and his church. Anything here about taking away from the bad, leading towards the good? Yeah.
I think about, for me personally, when I'm teaching like history to my kids, it's so easy to teach the American Revolution. It's really hard to teach slavery. And in this situation, they're not hiding from the bad things that happen. Because that's such a good teaching tool, is to learn from the mistakes to avoid them happening again.
Definitely. And for us to sit down and to look at things that are puzzling to us, there were multiple topics that when I was sitting downstairs with the high schoolers and Ryan was talking about them, it was really the first time I've heard these things discussed openly. You know, sometimes we would talk about them maybe at the table, sometimes we would talk about them on one-on-one conversations when I was even a younger Christian than I am now. And it was always just like, yeah, you know, this happened and we're doing it this way, but we're understanding why now. We're understanding why are we doing these things, how did we get to where we are right now, and hopefully we can approach that with a confident answer, not just a, yes, we do this because, but I'm convinced, you know, this is the way that we should be doing it. Anyone else? Okay, we'll push ahead. History helps us interpret the here and now. And just a little bit, we're going to be looking, I guess you could call it a norms slide of how I want us to be approaching history. And one of the norms that we're going to be talking about is this needs to be a class of inward reflection. Inward reflection. I think it's very easy for us when studying church history or anything related to, you know, how we came to be the individual group that we are right now, to say, well, it is because of the faults and failures of X, Y, and Z. Yes, that does help us understand the here and now. We should get a certain sense of how we got here. But again, we're focusing more on personal spiritual development rather than, well, I'm here because I don't want to be there, or I'm here because I heard they do that there. History helps us interpret the here and now. Why is this happening? How do we get to here? How do we deal with these issues in the past? And we're going to look back at different historical trends. One of the things that we talked about a lot in the high school class is, have we seen this before? Have we seen this before? Is this really truly a new idea that's coming up? Just two of the kind of pop culture current events that have been going on church history-wise. The Second Baptist Convention is in now their second year of huge, huge turmoil over issues of women in the church, what is going to be the role of women, what is going to be their particular church's stance on homosexuality. And you see, a lot of the conversation is, well, the church has never had to deal with this before. We need to know our history. We need to know our history. There's nothing new under the sun. We won't go to Ecclesiastes due to time, but nothing new. I tried this, I tried that, nothing new under the sun. And even locally here, I have many, many students, and even for a time in my early life where I attended the Methodist Church in Eureka, there was a very uncomfortable split there. And it's a split that has affected a lot of people in the community, a lot of people who, we probably live near in our neighborhoods. And again, a lot of that conversation was, well, our church, we were just unprepared to talk about this because it was a new issue. We were unprepared because, we've never been taught how to deal with these certain controversies because it's so new. It's not new. It's not new. These are historical trends. Even if the idea or the concept may seem newly invented, well, I can still assure you that the way we react with one another, the way that we talk and discuss with our brothers, that is not a new thing at all. That is still something that we can find a pattern in. Any comments here about interpreting the here and now? Yeah.
So in the early 2000s, there was like a few movements that became really popular with like a lot of the mega churches. I was largely unaware, I think a lot of us in the church aren't necessarily aware of what's happening in the bigger evangelical world. But I actually listened to a series of podcasts about what was happening back in the early 2000s. And with that information, I was able to put together what I experienced in the church. And it was history for me listening to the podcast, even though I lived through it. But, talk about interpreting the here and now. Had I had that information, I would have been able to look and say, oh, this is why people are thinking a certain way. This is why they're reacting this way. Having the same knowledge of history gives us the same language to be able to talk to each other. And, I didn't see that happening back then. So.
Yeah, definitely. And we're going to look at a lot of those different movements. The movements in the early 2000s, undoubtedly motivated and changed by 9/11. 9/11 America drastically changed the charismatic movement, the kind of end times movement that happened. There are a lot of different movements in the early 2000s. But they had a cause, and they had a reason for ending up where they were. And so that can help us in our conversations and also see, has that influenced us at all? Have we taken on any of that? Are there current things happening in our society that might want to creep in and influence the way that we do things? Thank you for that. Okay, our last one here. Last one. Thank you guys for staying with us. History motivates us. History motivates us. I'm going to go ahead and just say the Hebrews 11 section first, and then I do want to go and read the Romans. Just a quick answer, and hopefully we can all nod our head to that. Hebrews 11 is a list of historic figures, and my question is, who doesn't want to be a part of that? Who, whenever they read that list of this person did this great act, this person had this type of faith, this person trusted God, whenever we read that list of history, who doesn't want to be and associated with that? Or who doesn't want to be a part of that great cloud of witness? And one of the things that I want to do in this class is to say that list can continue. That list has continued for 2,000 years. There have been rock star believers, and we're going to mention a couple by name throughout these 14 weeks who I'd put there. I would put in that Hebrews 11 of my life of, man, this person, they were faced with this controversy, with this issue. They dealt with this in this sort of way, relying on God, having faith on God. And so let's mimic that. Let's mirror that. Obviously, the biblical example, that is our framework, that is our standard, that is our foundation. But we would be fools to say that no one has been striving for that standard in 2,000 years. Obviously, there have been great men and women who have, and great men and women who have achieved that. Yes, Morgan?
I love this, and I think it's so helpful. And I can see, like, in my own life, people who I've watched over the years who are decades ahead of me, and taken notes from them and taken pointers from them, and examples, people I look up to. Is that what you're saying church history is for? Is, like, of course our authority is the Bible. That is all. Nothing added to it, nothing taken away from it. But all of this church history kind of fills out a bigger picture about, like, examples and people that are affirming God's word. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. I was talking to Matt before class started about one of the songs they're going to be singing at their wedding. And it talks about the beauty of the church. You know, God created and designed the church to fulfill all these different things in our life. Let's study what that looked like. Let's study the 2,000 years of brother helping brother, of people relying on God in hard and difficult times. We're going to talk about the church during the Holocaust. We're going to talk about what did Christianity look like during the American Civil War and the slavery debate. Let's learn from those people, the people who are decades and generations and even, 1,800 years ahead of us. How did they deal with those situations? I want to imitate them. I want to mirror them. Okay, let's flip over to Romans 15, please. Romans 15. This will be the last passage we look at tonight. And then I want to end giving a little brief overview about where we're going to go in this class. Romans 15, if I could have someone, 1 through 7, please. Romans 15, 1 through 7, then we'll wrap up for the night.
We who are strong have an obligation to bear with the failings of the weak and not to please ourselves. Let each of us please his neighbor for his good, to build him up. For Christ did not please himself, but as it is written, the reproaches of those who reproached you fell on me. For whatever was written in the former days was written for our instruction, that through endurance and through the encouragement of the Scriptures we might have hope. May the God of endurance and encouragement grant you to live in such harmony with one another, in accord with Christ Jesus, that together you may with one voice glorify the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. Therefore welcome one another as Christ has welcomed you, for the glory of God.
Thank you, John. So yes, history gives instruction. It gives instruction to us. It gives us the facts. But history also gives us an endurance and an encouragement. That's something that we can gain from history. Doing the daily Bible reading, and we get encouragement from that. Well, I can tell you full-heartedly, reading the quotations from people who were suffering under the 3rd century Roman uproar, man, that was encouraging. That was encouraging. And I got that from history. I'm going to briefly just run through some of our words for caution. We're all Christians. We're all adults here. But I've talked with some people beforehand and felt like this slide was needed, something that we should just talk about. It's about personal growth and not external condemnation. I want this class to direct our spiritual lives to see how am I going to serve Christ better, knowing and understanding the history of his church. History is full of imperfect people. If you don't believe that, read any character in the Old or New Testament. Well, guess what? Those people are going to be the people we're learning about for the 2,000 years of church history. Use discretion. Use discretion. We want to stick to history. I know that there's a lot of things, maybe conspiracy theories, stuff like that. Whenever I took a contemporary issues class in high school, our teacher would love to just take a controversial issue and just throw that in the class as a grenade. That's not the structure for this class. We're going to stick to history. We're going to stick to history. And again, we're looking for the image of Christ and his church. There are different perspectives of refining what we believe. All right, we'll end with this. Maybe a little bit of an emotional point. You guys know I got to pull the heartstrings. As Americans, we love learning about our family history. We as a country are very patriotic. One of the ways that we show our patriotism in our country is by doing things like genealogies and family trees. We love that. We eat it up. We're a nation of immigrants. This is something that we can relate to. I'm going to try to convince us here that yes, we should study the history of our family. Let's start here. I don't really know what those people were like, but I know what they believed. I know what motivated them. I know what brought them to where they are right now. And we might be familiar with some of these people. That's great. That's awesome. Do we know them? That's what we're going to try to do in the class. Yes, we're going to hit some familiar names, but we're also going to hit people and be like, I had no clue that that person was involved in this issue, but yet the way that they taught it and did it is how we do it every Sunday morning. Let's learn about these people. Let's learn about these people. We're going to have the bell in just a minute, so I can go over an overview of where we're headed. Again, we're going to follow the structure of biblical pattern and then history. Biblical pattern and history. We'll start with creeds. How do we iron out heresy? How do we flesh out orthodoxy? We're going to learn about why creeds even came up in the first place and maybe why we don't lean that direction. We'll talk about that. Organization, that's things like church leadership, the way that we're structured, the way that we have fellowship with other people and maybe not fellowship with other people. Cooperation, things like money and missionary societies. We'll go into function. What's the purpose of the church? Why do we meet here? Why do we associate with one another? That's going to be a function. Is it a spiritual gospel or is it a social gospel? And then we'll actually spend 3 class periods on worship, starting with the biblical pattern, the biblical example of worship. How well have we kept that over history? Have we strayed? Where do we come back? And then we're going to end with a class talking about fellowship. The second part of the question for all of this is, if I disagree on one of these various issues with someone, is there then a fellowship problem? Is there then a question of, can I relate? We'll start next class with creeds. Any final comments? Thank you guys for sticking with us. Hey, Nick.
Is there a way that we can prepare for class each Wednesday that you would like us to do beforehand?
The stories and the concepts that I'm going to be sharing are going to be fairly unique. If there's a longer section of text that we might read, like for example, on the second class of creeds, we're going to go into the Nicene Creed. I know some of us from our religious upbringings can probably still say that, but I'll send that out for us to read ahead of time. So there will be certain historical documents, little primary sources that I'll send out, but it won't be in every class sort of thing. Awesome. Thank you guys. Looking forward to it.